Welcome back to class. This is American Federal Government. My name is Ken Hicks. We've been dealing with the issue of domestic policy. Today we're going to continue our discussion of domestic policy, of welfare policies and other kind of social policies designed to address inequality and to open up opportunities. And to basically talk a little bit about who benefits disproportionately from, various social policies. So again, these are our key topics. The welfare state. Number 3, the welfare state was created to address inequality. Number 4, social policies also address inequality. 5, social policies open opportunities for people. And 6, basically who benefits from social policy. And then we'll conclude with just some questions about what we think about American domestic policy. So the welfare state was designed to address insecurity. And again, the reason for that has a lot to do with how America evolved economically. For much of our history, America was predominantly a rural agrarian society. Those types of societies tend to be highly self-sufficient. They grow their own food, they make their own clothes. They don't really require a great deal from government per se. As we underwent industrialization, as we became an advanced and highly productive economy, we began to recognize that there are instances where economic dislocations cause problems. Okay, so one of the first things that began emerging was basically unemployment insurance. That is a contributory program that is funded by a combination of state and federal taxes. In most states, benefits only last about 26 weeks, but in periods of high unemployment, Congress can authorize an additional 13 weeks. Unemployment insurance comprised a critical component of the government's COVID-19 response. Okay, it was one of the main things that they were trying to do. Was we recognized for a period of time we're going to have to shut down at least parts of the economy, and that basically meant that there were going to be people unemployed through no fault of their own. That it was better for those folks to stay home than to be going to work, and so that was one of the things that we, that the federal government and the state governments kind of collaborated on doing. You also have the idea of partial compensation. For most workers, unemployment insurance only replaces a portion. It doesn't make you whole, it simply kind of keeps you going. Many American workers in the contemporary economy, particularly folks working in the gig economy, Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, Grubhub, food deliverers, they are oftentimes ineligible for unemployment insurance. And so, in many instances, when you talk about a gig economy, you're talking about people who are doing multiple part-time jobs at once. The problem with those kinds of jobs, they may make money for you. They may make enough to keep a roof over your head and be able to put gas in your car, but it doesn't give you insurance. And it doesn't give you the kinds of benefits that come with full-time employment. I should also add that a lot of people that work, for example, at Walmart, oftentimes they're basically designated as part-time employees. Many college students and even high school students that work at Walmart, they are basically kept below, I want to say, 30 hours. Because that basically means that Walmart doesn't have to pay them insurance, health insurance, and things like that. There are also non-contributory programs, and these are programs for which, again, beneficiaries don't have to contribute to receive benefits, and they're more commonly understood as what we might describe as welfare. Again, people seeking access to non-contributory programs basically have to fill out an application form in which they are basically demonstrating a financial need for assistance. So eligibility is determined via a process known as means testing. Okay? As part of the Social Security Act of 1935, Congress also created a cash assistance program known as Aid to Families with Dependent Children, as well as Aid to Poor, Elderly, Blind, and Disabled People, otherwise known as Old Age Assistance. These programs were later consolidated during the Eisenhower administration into what is now known as supplemental Social Security, or supplemental security income. Medicaid is the largest non-contributory program. It was created in 1965 along with the Medicare Act, and it provides medical services to low-income Americans. One of the main ways that the Affordable Care Act of 2010 was attempting to expand access to health care was compelling the states, basically trying to offer them a deal too good to refuse, to expand their own Medicaid programs. Non-contributory programs expanded significantly over the course of the late 1960s and 70s, and really kind of, again, contributed to a lot of the political controversies between, Democrats and Republicans to this very day. You also have an important non-contributory program known as Supplemental Nutrition Assistance, otherwise known as SNAP. It provides what are known as in-kind benefits. These are non-cash goods and services provided to needy individuals and families by the federal government. The 1994 midterm elections brought Republicans to control the House of Representatives for the first time in 40 years, and with it they basically wanted to fundamentally change many of these non-contributory programs. At various points over the course of the 1990s, Republicans tried to enact sharp cuts to Medicaid and other non-contributory programs. Ultimately, Republicans were able to work with Bill Clinton, and Clinton basically said, "We are ending welfare as we know it." In 1996, welfare programs that basically broke up the linkages between Medicaid, food stamps, and cash assistance resulted in replacing Aid to Families with Dependent Children, otherwise known as AFDC, with what is now known as Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, now known as TANF. And they also basically changed the way those things were funded. And again, one of the things that Republicans like to do is create block grants and give states, authority to manage a lot of these kinds of programs. What they don't do is continue the funding and make any sort of, they generally tend to want to cut the funding over time and shift that burden onto states. Now, some states, California, New York, a couple of others, have the resources to actually manage some of those programs. But even the largest states struggle to meet those kinds of those kinds of challenges. And so what it ultimately results in is simply lower quality assistance to the poor. Now again, conservatives and Republicans generally argue that what we want to do is get people into the workforce. And so we want, Republicans' rationale for doing this is to reduce dependence on federal and state poverty programs and welfare programs. And basically kind of say, I'm going to cut, we think that the welfare net has become a hammock. We want welfare to amount to a hand up and not a handout. And so they generally like to slowly kind of contract the access to those programs so that people are then compelled to go out into the workforce. The problem is that if there are not enough jobs for those folks, they simply run out of aid, and then they find themselves having to find whatever they can do to make ends meet. That makes things worse in a lot of places. When unemployment is running at 30%, in Detroit, there's not a lot of job opportunities to be had. Okay. So who runs non-contributory programs? Some means-tested non-contributory programs are run by the federal government with uniform eligibility criterion and benefits that are nationwide. SNAP, the school lunch programs, and supplemental security income. But many programs these days are run jointly by the federal government and the states. As a result, the benefits vary greatly by states. And again, what typically happens, and this is something that, again, Republicans have preferred to do, they want to return many of those kinds of non-contributory programs to the states, allow the states to make their own decisions regarding those programs, and then give them money in the form of block grants. Now, again, the challenge there is that if a state says, well, we're not going to help the poor at all, what that will often do is push people out of that state. They'll actually shed population, and folks will go to larger states that have large urban populations and generally have more generous welfare programs. So when you look at, for example, the maximum TANF funding, again, you can see a pattern that, when you look at temporary aid to needy families spending on a state basis, you'll find that many of the states of the former Confederacy, many of the states of the South and the southern tier of the Midwest have very, very low payments. Texas and Florida are exceptions because these are really high population states. And they have a much larger proportion of their population are living below the poverty line. It's simply not realistic for them to try and starve people into work. But if you look, Oklahoma is among those states that have among the lowest monthly TANF benefit spending. You also have tax expenditures. The United States provides social welfare benefits through tax breaks, and those tax breaks may include credits, tax deductions, and preferential tax rates that some analysts call the shadow welfare state. And in many instances, the shadow welfare state disproportionately benefits middle-class Americans. So tax expenditures include subsidies for benefits that employers may offer to their workers, such as medical insurance and retirement plans, both traditional pensions and then 401ks, which are basically private savings accounts that emerged in the 1970s with people, economists making the argument that giving individuals some control over their retirement savings would make them more aware of the concept of money and the need for savings. The results of that have been mixed. And again, why do we have this kind of a program? A lot of it came from around the middle of the 20th century, where, again, for example, during World War II, you had a severe labor shortage, and employers were trying to raise salaries in order to attract the best remaining workers to get them, to get the best workforce that they could, and that was causing enormous spikes in inflation. And so the federal governments, the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, their response was to say, we don't want you guys to be offering more money in the form of salaries. Instead, offer things like health insurance. And that's one of the ways we ended up with an employer-based insurance system. In other countries, in most countries that have advanced economies, they have national insurance plans where the government provides the insurance. Now, again, employer-based insurance worked very well for the United States until almost the 21st century. But over time, that has again become a problem because the nature of employment has changed. We no longer have lots and lots of people working in factories where you have 20 or 30,000 people working in one place. Increasingly, where that is the case, and you do have big box stores like Walmart and Target and places like that. In many instances, those places follow the Walmart model and really don't provide sufficient health care to their employees. Only full-time people get health care, and that creates, again, a problem. So the shadow welfare state, which I mentioned just a minute ago, again, includes examples on, include tax breaks that individuals can file for when they prepare their federal tax reforms. To illustrate, taxpayers can deduct from their income the amount they paid in home mortgage interest and in state and local taxes up to a limit. There are also state deductions for out-of-pocket medical expenses, child care, charitable contributions. Those tax breaks lower the effective cost of home ownership, health insurance, child rearing, and other kinds of subsidized activities. Again, in other words, it basically is a subsidy for the middle class, which again, most Americans fit that kind of profile. So most benefits are focused on middle and upper middle class income earners. Those benefits are often ignored because they're not as visible, but they cost the federal government up to $1 trillion in lost revenue. In other words, if those benefits were not provided, another $1 trillion would be added in federal tax revenue. So it's important to keep in mind that even when the government is not spending, they are oftentimes investing in ways that are designed to improve people's day-to-day lives. One thing that did happen also, again, during the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, I should say, was that a Republican-controlled Congress basically passed a tax cut plan. But one of the things they did was eliminate the subsidies in high-income states. In other words, in states like New York and California. They eliminated the ability of those states of tax filers in those states to use state and local taxes, on their properties to deduct from their federal income. And a lot of people, including Republicans in those states, are very upset about that particular aspect of the Trump tax cuts, and that's going to be a fight that's going to be coming up in the near term. So you also have social policies that are designed to open up additional opportunities, and that includes things like education, health, and housing policies that are designed to try and again open up, it's important that the federal government maximize people's life opportunities. The more Americans that have good paying jobs, the more taxpayers there are, the lower the tax burden. That makes everybody happier. Education policies are the single most important force in the distribution and redistribution of opportunity in America. It is an unpopular thing to say. There are a lot of conservatives out there that argue that a college education has declined, that not everyone needs a college education. But the reality is that people who earn a college degree from an accredited public or private institution, not necessarily a for-profit, I want to exclude them from the beneficiary aspect of things. That people who earn a degree earn more money over their lives, and generally, have more successful lives because of the information that they get from a college education. So education policies are almost entirely set at the state and local level. Okay, certainly for most of our history, education was almost exclusively a local matter. As we began to industrialize, state governments began to do more to invest in education, particularly in like what we would now call K through 12 education. At that time, they were doing more what we would call preparatory academies, which would encompass anywhere from high school to your associate's degree. In fact, Rogers State University began as a preparatory academy. The Soviet launch of Sputnik in 1957 led to the federal government beginning to make significant investments in education. That includes the National Defense Education Act, which was again designed to improve. These days we're dealing with a lot of people trying to emphasize the idea of STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. This is not the first time we've had that kind of recognition that we need to invest in those kinds of skill sets. So again, in the late 1950s, we did the same thing. And even earlier, during the Progressive era, the template for modern education was largely drawn from Germany and their gymnasia, approach to education. So we began kind of, creating institutions rather than just having things kind of grow organically at the local level. So in 1965, Congress passed the Elementary and Secondary Education Act that offered federal support for school districts with substantial numbers of students with low-income parents. Today, the federal government contributes about 10% of all spending on K through 12 education, with state and local governments each contributing roughly 45%. And again, congressional failure to update the formula for providing funds has actually eroded federal funding because oftentimes federal funding has become less and less targeted over time as, again, successive administrations come in, they pursue different kinds of educational priorities, and that again further kind of dilutes what the federal government is trying to do. And it's important to keep in mind, the federal government, most importantly, what they want to do is equalize the quality of education. Again, we don't have a singular educational system, okay? We have 50 state educational systems. And then within each state, it's further decentralized at the local level. Just think about it in these terms. There are over 4,000, I think it's 4,400 counties alone in the United States. Okay? And so in many instances, in many states, each of the counties have their own school districts, and sometimes multiple school districts, especially in the heavily urbanized places. Like, is it best that Tulsa and Oklahoma City's school districts are just one? Oklahoma County is most of Oklahoma City. Is it good that over 1 million people packed into that area, that's only one school district? Or Tulsa County, which again has a population of several hundred thousand, is that a good idea? Can one superintendent manage school districts that size? Again, that presents real challenges in terms of how we administer education that is oftentimes not really considered very carefully. In 2001, there's a bipartisan effort to pass what became known as the No Child Left Behind Act, that was again designed to improve the quality of education and overall the equality of opportunity. There was greater emphasis placed on testing to basically evaluate and assess the effectiveness of each school and how their students are learning. Again, the problem with that, and again, there were really punitive punitive aspects of the No Child Left Behind law included, which basically meant if the students at schools persistently performed at a low level, you would fire all the administrators. And so, again, that was a significant consequence that oftentimes it was not the fault of the principals or the administrators. It was, and it wasn't oftentimes the fault of the teachers. Part of the problem is that in many instances, because of housing patterns, many of the kids attending certain schools are coming into their educational environments with very little in the way of an educational foundation. They're oftentimes, it's very difficult to teach kids to read, for example, when their parents don't read to them. Is one of the most significant correlates of educational success is to see your parent reading, not simply because it's part of their job or reading out of some obligation, but reading for enjoyment. When you see, when both parents read because they enjoy reading, it really impresses upon children that reading is not just this thing you have to do, but it's actually something that can unlock their imagination. They can do it for fun. Kids who read for fun have more open minds. They're more curious. They learn much more quickly. And so when you've got a bunch of kids that are packed into school districts that are coming out of households where they don't read, and they're not reading effectively, you have a lot more remedial efforts that have to be undertaken. And that generally means that a standardized test applied to that kind of student body is going to result in poor scores. And so states began to reckon with that reality over the course of having the No Child Left Behind Act work its way out. So that has produced a number of challenges. Critics of No Child Left Behind also argued that it has encouraged teachers to do what is known as teaching to the test. Rather than teaching the subject, they're teaching kids how to do better, test-taking strategies rather than subject matter. And that has also reduced classroom instruction time and disproportionately punished schools that basically are serving low-income districts. And again, part of the rationale, some people would argue then would criticize Republicans basically saying what you really want to do is just destroy education, public education in these low-income districts. What will come to replace those things? For-profit education so that you can make money on educating poor kids? Is that going to result in an improved education and more equality of opportunity? I think those are serious questions that have to be addressed. Race to the top, the Obama administration kind of tried to decentralize the No Child Left Behind Act, and they granted states a lot of exemptions. This is one thing you'll find in many instances. In a lot of instances, Republican administrations will impose pretty sharp requirements for states to do certain things a certain way, and then oftentimes Democratic, especially as it relates to education, and then Democratic administrations, both Clinton and then later Obama, they would come in and try to loosen those restrictions. Okay, and Obama especially, because of course No Child Left Behind didn't exist under Clinton, but Obama basically granted states a number of exemptions so that they didn't have to impose those punitive conditions on their own educational systems. Obama also created a $4.3 billion grant program for state educational programs, and so to be eligible, states had to agree to lift caps on the creation of charter schools. The Obama administration was very much supportive of charter schools. And I want to say something about charter schools. There are a number of states where charter schools work very well. Massachusetts is sort of a perfect example. Massachusetts has one of the most privatized educational systems in the United States, and it's also very high quality. And to the extent that they do have public education, much of their public education is comprised of charter schools. But they are managed, they are regulated charter schools, where the state, the state actually still retains some sort of supervisory control over what's happening. In some states like Michigan, where Donald Trump's first Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, was very influential in kind of constructing their charter school system. This is a woman, Betsy DeVos, who went to private schools herself and who calls public schools government schools. So she's one of those folks who doesn't believe in public education. In Michigan, they created a highly privatized and highly unregulated charter school system. And the charter schools do not perform quite as well there. And you'll find in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina that Louisiana attempted to resort to more and more charter schools in an attempt to improve education. They followed the Michigan model, and in many instances, they didn't have the same outcomes. And so it is impossible to ignore a very hard reality, and that is with education, as with so many things in life, you get what you pay for. And if you chronically underinvest in low-income school districts, you're going to get poor educational outcomes. It's harder to educate poor children. That is simply a primordial fact of educational policy. So under Trump, again, Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos strongly advocated for loosely regulated charter schools and more voucher plans. And again, Republicans are very much in favor of vouchers. And that involves granting parents portable credits that allow them to spend, on the school of their choice. And again, here in Oklahoma, they're trying to get, again, where they can use private, they can use vouchers to pay for private education. And again, I think that's kind of problematical. Nevertheless, vouchers are, again, one of those vehicles where the argument is you give parents more control over their children's education. Now, parents have that control by, typically, when they move, they try to identify school districts where, that are high performing. But again, that oftentimes leads to parents migrating out of low-income areas into areas where the school, migrating from kind of central Tulsa into the Union District or the Jenks District. Okay, so the rich get richer, and wealthy school districts get more students, and oftentimes that creates problems for them. And then you get fewer and fewer students in many of these central schools. Again, that's not necessarily going to be the most effective and efficient way of improving education overall. The federal government has a significant role to play in higher education. There's this idea of a wage premium. College graduates earn up to 50% more than people who only earn high school diplomas. And again, that constitutes an important gateway to equality of opportunity. I would say this too. Not every kid needs to go to college. Some kids can be very successful, getting a high school degree and then just going maybe to technical school. If you decide that you want to work in the housing industry, you don't necessarily need a college education unless, of course, you want to own a housing, a construction company, in which case a college degree would probably benefit you. So again, people talk a lot about self-made folk, people like Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan said, I went to Boston College for a couple of semesters, decided it didn't work for me. He nevertheless was able to break into acting. He was in a sitcom back in the 90s. He ran a couple of different reality shows. Now he's got one of the most successful podcasts in America. He makes far more money than I do with my advanced degrees and everything else. Ask yourself, how much of that is a factor of good fortune? He was lucky to be able to become a celebrity. What proportion of Americans are going to be able to pursue that pathway? The argument for higher education is that your pathways to a middle class and even an upper middle class life broaden significantly. There are far more opportunities. If one opportunity closes down, having that college degree will maintain more opportunities than you would otherwise have without that college degree. So as with K through 12 education, most higher education historically has been funded at the state level. For many years, again, the argument was states would invest in higher education because they believed that it improved their state's economy. That states that had strong institutions of public and private, higher education, that meant more and more of their people would be college graduates. And it's clear, it is actually an important, factor in many states. The states that are most economically productive have a higher percentage of college graduates in them. Now ask yourself, do a quick Google search and ask yourself where Oklahoma rates in terms of the number of people, the number of Oklahomans with college degrees. We're near the bottom, okay? So federal programs have made important contributions to promoting equal access to higher education. The first and most important demonstration of the power of a college education was the GI Bill, which was passed in 1944. And that put higher education within the reach of a whole generation of World War II veterans, most of whom would never have been able and had no thought of going to college until that opportunity was made for them. And so the GI Bill, and think about the 5 million, I can't even remember, it might have even been 15 million Americans that served in uniform over the course of World War II. How many of them, instead of just going back to their hometowns and working with their hands, became doctors, lawyers, dentists, accountants, professionals? That single law had a dramatic effect on America's economic fortunes. Likewise, the National Defense Education Act offered low-interest loans to college students, while the Higher Education Act, again, supplied assistance directed to colleges and offered additional need-based grants allocated to students by universities. You also have the very successful Pell Grant program. The Pell Grant, again, offers grants directly to lower-income students. Since the mid-1970s, states have sharply reduced their investment in higher education, and that has contributed to dramatically higher costs and increased student debt. The growing costs of higher education have put college out of reach for many lower-income students and have left those who attend with a heavy load of debt. In the 2 decades between 1996 and 2016, average student debt among seniors graduating from four-year colleges had more than doubled after accounting for inflation, from $12,000 to almost $30,000, with lower-income students carrying significantly greater debt loads. Also in this period, you saw the dramatic expansion of for-profit universities like Phoenix University, whose business model is to encourage students to take out the maximum amount of their student loans. Okay? And that has, again, in many instances, students that attend for profits end up without a college degree, but with a significant amount of student debt. And that is, again, to me, the for-profit universities should be subject to much more scrutiny than they are currently, allocated by the federal government through Congress. I would also note Rogers State University has an enormously high proportion of its student body that are Pell eligible. And that is, again, suggestive of who comes to Rogers State University. A disproportionate number of them are low-income students. A disproportionate number of them are first in their family attending college. Okay. You also have the idea of, again, public health policies. While no government agencies were directly concerned with individual health care until fairly recently, public health has always been accepted as a shared and public responsibility. The first kind of establishment of a board of health was New York City's in 1867. Following, I believe it was an outbreak of cholera or something like that. It's important to keep in mind, there was concern about public health going all the way back to colonial times. You periodically had outbreaks of yellow fever and cholera and other kinds of, again, these are mass diseases that cause significant mass casualty events. So it's important to note that the U.S. Public Health Service was created in 1798. It was headed by a Surgeon General, and today it includes the major public health agencies like the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, and the Centers for Disease Control. The CDC's purpose is to track the spread of disease and to figure out ways of minimizing mortality. Okay? These days, all these things exist within a cabinet-level department called Health and Human Services. And Donald Trump has decided that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will head that department. Now, I want to note something. Robert Kennedy has no medical degree. He has no degree in science. He does not have a degree in epidemiology or immunology. He has no formal training in medicine. He is a lawyer by training who failed the bar exam in New York City and had to resign from an appointed position with the Southern District of New York. Okay, he established a reputation for himself as an environmentalist. Okay, but he has subsequently become a conspiracy theorist as it relates to things like vaccines. He is a vaccine skeptic. He has made bizarre arguments that COVID-19 was created and designed to attack certain racial groupings. Okay, so it's important to be aware of who's going to be in charge after January 20th. Okay. There is an important environmental health connection. Again, we have laws that are designed to protect the environment. The creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the creation of the Consumer Product Protection Commission illustrate the belief that environmental pollution contributes to poor health outcomes. And also, again, the Consumer Product Protection Commission is designed to protect low-income consumers from being scammed by again, people saying that they have this healthy product. I think I mentioned, the idea about Prevagen being this amazing miracle drug that improves your memory. They have had to fundamentally alter their advertising campaigns because the Food and Drug Administration was coming after them for making claims that they couldn't support through scientific studies. So again, health policies aimed directly at the poor include, again, nutritional programs like SNAP, school lunch programs, and again, Medicaid. Healthcare reform. The United States is the only advanced industrial nation that lacks universal access to healthcare. Part of the reason for this was the opposition of the American Medical Association during the New Deal. Because the New Deal, as far back as the New Deal, they talked about providing universal health care. The American Medical Association opposed that. The result, again, is a patchwork system and generally only partial access to health care with rapidly rising costs of employer-based insurance, oftentimes eroding the quality of care for many Americans. And I include people at RSU among that because, again, we are a public university. We are obliged to provide, as a university, the administration is obliged to provide health insurance, and they have had to go with the cheaper deals because of cuts to higher education. The Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, prioritized, again, the idea of providing comprehensive access to health care. It contained three key elements: the creation of insurance exchanges that were state managed, the idea of an individual mandate, the requirement that that every person, every American has to either have an employer-based or purchase their own insurance. And then third, subsidies for individuals and small businesses. Again, the point behind the Affordable Care Act was to make it to be too good of a deal to be turned down. Nevertheless, 21 Republican-controlled states filed lawsuits against the Affordable Care Act, claiming that the Affordable Care Act's mandate was unconstitutional. In 2012, the Supreme Court upheld the Affordable Care Act, and then in 2017, Republicans, when they controlled both the House and the Senate, attempted to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. They never got to the point where they could replace it, though. All they could do was destroy it. And they ultimately failed because one Republican senator voted no on the Affordable Care Act, because John McCain basically went into the well of the Senate and did thumbs down. And in the meantime, many aspects of the Affordable Care Act have become very popular, and overall access to health care has improved fairly dramatically. And I'll show you with this next slide. If you look upwards of, for much of the 1970s into the 21st century, access, almost 20% of Americans lacked access to health care, to health insurance. Today, it's less than 10%. Okay, so it's halved the number of people who currently don't have access to health care. You also have housing policies, and again, the point, again, you had many people in the United States that were living in homes that didn't have running water and that didn't have indoor plumbing. These are, and again, there are consequences that flow with living in, multiple families in homes that are in those kinds of circumstances. And so access to affordable, quality housing provides individuals and families with stability and protection from pollution, disease, injury, anxiety, and depression. Most federal housing policies originated during the Great Depression, beginning with the Stigall National Housing Act of 1937. As a result of federal housing programs, the percentage of Americans living in overcrowded conditions, which was defined by the U.S. Census Bureau as more than one person living per room, fell from 20% in 1940 to 9% in 1970. Over the same period, the proportion of American households living in substandard housings, which was defined as lacking a complete kitchen or bathroom facilities, declined from 50% to only 8%. Okay? So when people say that, that American housing policies have failed, they really are simply wrong. They don't have the facts. Okay? Has it worked perfectly? No. And in part because of racism. Because policies in the middle of the 20th century encouraged white people to be able, and invested in white people being able to own single-family homes, and shunted minority, Americans into public housing, into, ghettos, effectively, into projects. Okay. So despite those improvements, public housing has largely been characterized as a failure. And the primary reasons why housing policies has failed is racial discrimination, inadequate maintenance, states being unwilling to do the things necessary to invest in public housing. And again, it has oftentimes had the effect of concentrating poverty in ways that have significantly worsened the effects of poverty in America. Discrimination in housing is widespread. Again, the basic orientation of federal housing policies changed in the 1980s with a shift towards vouchers, where again, the point of a voucher is you say, we are giving you a credit. You can use that credit to then purchase your own access to housing. You again have a disgraceful legacy of redlining in American housing policies. That refers to both banking and real estate agencies refusing to issue mortgage loans or extend credit in predominantly minority neighborhoods. The fact that white Americans were given access to low-interest loans for single-family homes while blacks were shunted into public housing, again, perpetuated the vast disparities in personal wealth between whites and blacks to this day. So, who gets what from social policies? Contributory, non-contributory, and tax expenditure programs are designed. They're designed to target certain groups of Americans. And what most Americans don't realize is that many of these programs are designed to help the middle class, to keep the middle class in the middle class. okay? So again, when you look at who benefits most, the elderly tend to be the single greatest beneficiary. The upper and middle, the middle and upper classes tend to be second. The working poor tend to follow third. The non-working poor trail behind. And unsurprisingly, minorities, women, and children benefit the least from these kinds of programs, from America's welfare programs. Okay? Here's a couple of slides to show you. When you look again, the blue here are federal taxes, and the red are state and local taxes. When you look at who pays the most in taxes, okay, what do you see? There is a certain amount of progressivity that remains within the U.S. tax system, within the federal system. But if you look at state and local taxes, that is the very image of how a regressive tax system works. The bottom 20% of people living in the states pay 12% of state and local taxes. The top 1% only pay 9% of state and local taxes. The wealthy are taxed at the state level at significantly lower rates. And again, when you look at it and you say, well, look at the top one, they pay almost a quarter of all the federal taxes. It used to be a lot higher, in fact. It gets back to this idea of ability to pay. When you look at the shares of total taxes paid compared to shares of total income, and again, the orange here is the share of total income versus the share of taxes paid. You get a sense in which, again, you're looking at a progressive tax system. Where if you look at the top 1%, they're 20%, just over 20% of the total income, but they're 24% of the share of the total taxes paid. When you look at how the tax burden is falling, what are you looking at? The next 4%, they're 15% of the share of the total economy, but they're paying 16% of the income. Then you look at the next 15%. It's almost, again, identical. So again, you're looking at a somewhat progressive tax system. And we oftentimes ask this question, right? Is our tax system fair? And most Americans would say, no, we don't think it's fair, but for different reasons, right? Conservatives consistently say that they believe that the poor are not taxed enough. And liberals consistently say that the wealthy get away with tax evasion on a massive scale and are not paying enough in taxes. And so if you just look at Americans saying, do you think taxation is fair? Everyone seems to think that it's unfair, but for fundamentally different reasons. Okay? That is the basic kind of challenge that we're looking at here. So domestic policy, what do you think? Economic and social policies raise issues that cut to the core of Americans' lives and livelihoods. Government policies will affect your future job opportunities, what kinds of further education or training you can access, and where you may live. Changing policy in any of the areas we've discussed involves making tough decisions. If you think more government funding should be provided for college financial aid, where does that money come from? Does it come from housing policy? Does it come from health policy? The domestic policy pie is relatively, it's distributed largely through three basic things, and that is Social Security, Medicaid, and Medicare. So how are you going to cut that particular slice of the pie? How do you go about figuring out what you're going to do, to arrange? Now, again, we have had an election. Republicans appear to have narrowly retained control over the House of Representatives. They now have a 53-47 majority in the Senate, and they will control the White House going into 2025. What's going to happen? When you think about, what Donald Trump has promised to do, what is the single most likely thing that he's going to do starting on day one? He said he's going to start rounding up undocumented immigrants. Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt has said he will eagerly participate in the rounding up of undocumented immigrants in Oklahoma. Greg Abbott in Texas has said likewise. What are going to be the consequences of the Trump administration's priority on expelling as many undocumented immigrants as they can identify? If you own a home and you need housework done, if you need a new roof, what's that going to do? We all eat food. Who's going to pick all those agricultural products? What is going to be the impact? What is going to be the effect of that if you round up, if you are effective and get 1 million undocumented immigrants out of the workforce immediately within the first 8 months? First of all, that's going to involve rounding up around 90,000 people a week. How are you going to get there? Where are you going to put those people? How are you going to get them out of the country? And then what are going to be the economic costs? Because you're basically, even if the Trump administration isn't successful at rounding those folks up, do you think they're going to continue showing up for work, or are they going to go underground? Are they going to try to find, non-legitimate ways of earning income? What will happen? What's going to happen to the cost of eggs? What's going to, I heard more about that as an economic indicator. Eggs are how much, a dozen. Do you think that rounding up undocumented immigrants is going to lower the cost of eggs? What about the price of an automobile? If you need to buy a new car, think about how many cars and how many parts come from outside the country. If Donald Trump imposes, tariffs on Mexico and Canada, like he's saying, like he promised over this past weekend, what's going to happen if he does that? What's going to happen to the price of a car? Do you think that the auto manufacturers will just absorb the higher costs that are going to come from bringing goods in? Or are they going to pass those costs along to the consumer? A car that costs $25,000 now will probably cost $32,000, in the coming years. So some questions to consider. Most conservatives press for freer markets and less government, while most liberals have defended the need for market regulation and more government intervention in the economy. Where do you stand? This is one of those marker questions. You learn a lot about yourself the more information you have, okay? I absolutely believe in free markets. I also believe that free markets can be manipulated. And free markets frequently are manipulated to benefit people, that have disproportionate wealth within the system. So if you believe in free markets, you also have to believe in a certain amount of government intervention, because if you allow the markets to simply operate in an unregulated way, people with sufficient resources will play with the system. They'll find ways of getting more and more money, because that's basically, just how they are operating. Second question. Do you tend to agree with liberals who often argue that more generous social policies are needed if the United States is truly going to ensure equality of opportunity? Or do you tend to agree with conservatives who often argue that social policies offer income support and take the idea of equality too far and do for individuals what those individuals should be doing for themselves? What's the problem there? Again, it's not just that individuals are these sui generis, people sitting out in the world. They're people that come out of certain backgrounds. Low-income Americans have fewer opportunities oftentimes for a reason, because again, there are narrower pathways than there are for people who are raised in the middle class. What do you think is the government's most effective tool in economic policy making? Fiscal policy, monetary policy, or other forms of regulation? Each of them are important levers, right? You have to pull each lever in that most, in the most, effective way. Like for example, one of the things that a lot of people argued about the Biden administration was that inflation was the result of all the spending, all the big investments that they made through the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act. Okay. Now there are a number of arguments that could be made about that. One thing that Biden didn't do is that he didn't go to the Fed chairman and say, I want you to lower interest rates. He allowed the Fed to operate independently. The Fed raised interest rates at various points in time, and now they recognize that now they've done what they needed to do, or whatever monetary policy can do through inflation. Now, some economists have argued that first and foremost that the CARES or that the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, that they really weren't that large in the overall scale of things, but that Biden could have done more to reduce inflation by immediately after 2022 using the Office of Management and Budget to slow down the rate at which the CARES Act and the CHIPS Act were spending money. That a slight reduction in federal spending might have had the effect of lowering inflation a bit. I think that's a plausible argument, and that's something that can be laid at the feet of the Biden administration. Nevertheless, here in Oklahoma, if you're looking at any of the construction that's taking place in this state, it's largely the result of the Inflation Reduction Act. It's doing a lot of really important things. So fiscal policy is a significant thing. Now, it's also important to keep in mind the federal government has been running a deficit going all the way back, I believe, to 2001 or 2002. When you think about it, when George W. Bush came into office, the federal government was actually taking in slightly more money than it was spending as a result of the Clinton administration's fiscal policies. From that point in time, you have had two Republican administrations that have cut taxes, which again reduces the amount of money going into the federal government. And in many instances, they have dramatically increased spending. What are the long-term consequences of that? Running deficits, and again, I think it's easy to say we're gonna fall apart because of the fact that we've been running deficits, and we now have a national debt that's something like $32 trillion. That's a lot of money, by the way, but we are producing $26 trillion annually. So if someone says we're becoming like Greece, that's a tell. That should indicate to you that they think you don't know anything about economics. Okay? The United States has the largest economy in the world. We are the wealthiest country in the world. We have the most stored wealth in the world. But can we continue running, deficits in the trillions of dollars indefinitely? The answer is no. And the question is, which political party will do the responsible thing? Now, how you go about reducing the deficit is, again, going to be a matter of partisan differences. But neither Republicans nor Democrats are prepared to, for example, to raise taxes. And both Republicans and Democrats are saying that they're not going to, cut entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare, which is, again, roughly 60% of federal spending. So where do we get to a point where our federal spending comes into something like balance? So what impact did, for example, coronavirus, did the COVID-19 pandemic have on American domestic policy? What is the likely impact if we have another pandemic? Now, we were fortunate, and it's a mixed bag. We were fortunate and unfortunate that we had pretty much a century pass from one really significant mass, pandemic to the next. Is there any guarantee that we won't have another pandemic that comes around that causes significant amounts of mass casualties? The scary thing about COVID-19 was that it was incredibly transmissible. There are typically two dimensions that we talk about: transmissibility versus virulence. Virulence refers to the likelihood that it's going to kill a person that a virus infects. COVID-19 was problematical in two ways. One, it was incredibly transmissible. But ultimately, it only killed around 2% of the people that contracted it. But when you're dealing with a highly contagious virus, that is a significant public health problem. Now, again, think about what we have gone through. It's becoming clear now that there is a significant subset of Americans, a significant percentage of Americans, that believe that public health went too far, and that public health experts were somehow part of the problem and not part of the solution. What are going to be the consequences of that going forward when you think about the possibility of a future pandemic? What is the likelihood that if we have another kind of significant pandemic event, that Americans will refuse to obey public health directives? And instead of losing, however many people we lost, well over 1 million people, I believe. I think it's close to 1.2 million people. We lose 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 million people. The United States is a significant percentage of the global mortality from COVID-19. What explains that? A big part of it is our political culture, that the fact that we place so much emphasis on individuality, on personal autonomy. People are, and I completely sympathize with people, with small salon owners and gym owners who basically were saying, I'm going out of business because I can't bring people into my establishment. I think more should have been done to try and make those people whole, to make sure that those people were not disproportionately affected by the public health, things that were needed to be done. But nevertheless, if we have another kind of event like COVID-19, I think we are more poorly prepared than we were the last time. Now, of course, again, one of the things that was remarkable about the COVID-19 response was that we were able to develop a vaccine in a very short period of time. And the reason for that was that scientists had been studying bird flu for decades. And so we were able to make a leap and innovate and because of investments during the Trump administration to develop a vaccine as quickly as possible. But now you have people coming into positions of authority that don't believe in vaccines. I mean, this is the challenge that we confront. This is the public challenge that we confront. So one last question. What do you think government should increase spending on, if any? Social insurance, social assistance, or tax expenditures? Who would tend to benefit most from your plan? And again, I get it if you think, well, I think we should help the middle class. I think that's an important priority for most governments. But I think, again, the fact that we have such a large percentage of Americans that are falling out of the middle class, joining the ranks of the working poor, that more working poor Americans are now, falling into poverty, I think that's a real challenge. And again, how you go about addressing those challenges is an important question. And it's a question that, again, we would be better off if the two political parties were engaging with one another. I was talking with a relative the other day, and they're on the other. They disagree with another person about politics, and they say, I've been hearing this nonsense. I'll use a different word for what they said. For 4 years about what we need to do. And I said, the problem is you might hear stuff, but you're not listening. And that's a bigger problem for Americans, that we hear and are offended by what other people say, but we don't really listen to them, and we don't make an effort to engage with them. We need to do a more effective job of engaging on issues that relate to Americans. And we need to confront the idea that a lot of Americans think that a lot of other Americans aren't American or aren't American enough, and on those grounds can be treated differently. And we need to confront that reality and call it for what it is, and figure out whether we can give respectful hearings to those kinds of sentiments. Because those kinds of sentiments right now are winning elections. All right, that's all I have for our presentation on domestic policy. We have 2 more lectures to go. When I come back, we're going to deal with the issue of foreign policy, which deals, again, with the idea that we have to protect our national security, and we have to advance our national interests in the world. I'll see you next time.